Okay, so this is the key to section 6.6 part A. That's one where we're going to factor quadratic equations or solve quadratic equations by factoring. All right, so let's look at number one. In number one, I want you to notice something. This is already factored. This is already in factored form. So we're going to use, remember that's called the zero factor property. So the zero factor property says that if you have two or more factors whose product is zero, now that has to be zero, it can't be any other number, it has to be zero. So if you have two or more factors whose product is zero, then in order for that to happen, one of these has to be equal to zero. So either this factor is zero or this factor is zero. Okay, so that's what we're going to use in these problems. Okay, so what this says is that I have these two factors. My first factor is 3x minus 1. My second factor is 2x plus 5, so that product is 0. In order for that product to be 0, the only way that can happen is if 3x minus 1 equals 0 or 2x plus 5 equals 0. Alright, so I have this quadratic equation and I ended up with two linear equations. And so I'm going to solve each of these linear equations. And what I use here was a zero factor property. Alright, so I'm going to use properties of equality to help me with this. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides. So I get 3x equal 1. And then get the variable x by itself. Since I'm multiplying by 3, I'm going to divide both sides by the coefficient 3. So I'm going to get my first solution is x equal 1/3. Okay? Over here, I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides. Combine like terms, this is 0. So I get 2x equal a negative 5. And to get the variable x by itself, I'm going to divide both sides by 2. And I get x to be a negative 5/2. So again, just leave it as a fraction. And reduce it if you can, though. And so my solutions are 1/3, comma, negative 5/2. Alright, so you can write it like this in brace notation. Don't use parentheses though. Use a brace if you're going to do it like this. Or you can just say something like this. X equal 1/3, comma, x equal negative 5/2. Okay, something like that. Alright, number 2. Look at number 2. Again, this is already factored. Now you can think of this as one factor, although it's 2. See, negative 5 is a factor, x is a factor, and x minus 5 is a factor. But we always, in most cases, we tend to just leave this monomial here as one factor we set equals 0, although it's 2. Negative 5 is a factor, x is a factor, but we're going to think of this as 1. So here's one factor, and here's the other. We set both of them equal to 0. I'm using the zero factor property. In order for these two things, in order for negative 5x and x minus 5, in order for that product to be 0, one of these has to be 0. Alright, so I'm going to set both of them equal to 0. And so when I set both of them equal to 0, to get x by itself here, I'm going to divide both sides by negative 5. And so negative 5 divided by negative 5 is 1. 1 times x is x. 0 divided by negative 5. You have to remember what that is from a couple of semesters ago. If you don't remember, use your calculator. 0 divided by negative 5 is 0. So that's one of your solutions. One of your solutions is 0. And you can check it for an instance. Over here, if you look at this factor, 0 minus 5 is a negative 5. So that's negative 5. Negative 5 times 0 is 0. 0 times a negative 5 gives you 0. Okay? Alright, then you do the other one. So either negative 5x is equal to 0 or x minus 5 is equal to 0. And remember, I went from this quadratic equation. It's quadratic because if it distribute, you're going to get x times x, which is x squared. So it is quadratic. So I went from this quadratic equation to two linear. And so to solve this linear equation, just going to add 5 to both sides, so you get x equal 5. Right, and you can check it again. Negative 5 times 5 is negative 25. 5 minus 5 is 0. And negative 25 times 0 is still 0. So again, your solutions are x equals 0 and x equals 5. Alright, the next one. Now, the difference between number 3 and the first two is that the first two, it was already factored. Your quadratic equations had already been factored. So when you look at number 2, and we got to first of all make sure it's in standard form. We use the word standard form. So standard form means that before you can factor, standard form means you're gonna make sure that your quadratic polynomial looks like this, or the quadratic equation looks like this: ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So all your terms have to be on one side and 0 has to be on the other. And we do have this here. So notice all my terms is on one side and 0 is on the other. So this is standard form. Okay? Now, if you had multiply this out, it would be in standard form because 0 is over here. If you multiply this out, FOIL it out, it would be in standard form because 0 is over here. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and factor. So the next step is to factor. Once it's in standard form, to solve this equation, remember standard form. Once it's in standard form, then you're going to factor. You're going to factor. Once you factor, then you're going to use the zero factor property. Alright, so that's going to be your steps. So you're going to make sure it's in standard form. Once it's in standard form, which it is, you're going to factor. And then once you factor, you're going to use a zero factor property. Okay, now make sure though at this step you say equals 0 because this is still an equation. So make sure that all of these steps are equivalent. If that's an equal 0, then you better make sure that's an equal 0 here because you want them to be equivalent. You want each step to be equivalent. Alright, so I'm going to use trial and error to figure out what the factorization is. And I think what's going to work will be 6 and 3. So 6, 3, and the 6 would have to be negative and the 3 would have to be positive. And check yourself. X times x is x squared. A negative 6 times a positive 3 is a negative 18. The outer is a positive 3x. The inner is a negative 6x. When I add them up, a negative 6x and a positive 3x is a negative 3x. Alright, so I've factored. The next step is to solve this equation using the zero factor property. So that means that if you have two or more factors whose product is 0, then one of them has to be 0. Alright, so and you do have this here. This factor times this factor is equal to 0. So one of these has to be 0. So x minus 6 equals 0. X plus 3 equals 0. And notice I went from this quadratic equation to two linear. So you just solve for x. So x equals 6, x equals negative 3. And again, you can always check your work. Let's check the 6. All right, let's check this. And remember, you don't have to, but it's a good idea to check it. Now, you're not going to have time for a test, but for a worksheet or My Math Lab, you're going to have time. All right, so check it. So you have x, wherever you see an x, you're going to plug in 6. You can plug in 6. So I have 6 squared minus 3 times 6 minus 18, and I want to see if that's going to equal 0. Remember, all you're doing is checking. It's not necessary. 6 squared is 36. A negative 3 times 6 is a negative 18 minus 18. Again, you want to see if that's going to equal 0. 36 minus 18 is 18. 18 minus 18 is equal to 0. And you would do the same thing for negative 3. Alright, so your solutions are x equals 6, comma, x equal negative 3. Alright, let's look at the next one. So number 4, we have y squared minus 5x equals 0. So for this one, you're going to notice that the GCF here is x. Alright, so that's how you're going to factor that, and you're going to factor out an x. So I get x times x minus 5 equal 0. Always check yourself. X times x is x squared. X times a negative 5 is a negative 5x. And make sure you say equals 0. You have to keep each of these equivalent. Now notice the next step. So remember, we forgot to check and see if it's a standard form, but it is. So the first thing is to make sure it's in standard form. Then we factored. And now we're going to set each factor equal to 0. So if I have two or more products, two or more factors whose product is 0, then one of these has to be 0. So these are the two factors. So I'm going to set each of those things that are underlined equal to 0. So x equals 0 or x minus 5 equals 0. So again, notice I went from this quadratic equation to two linear equations. So this one's already by itself. X is already by itself, so there's a solution. Here to get x by itself, I'm going to add 5 to both sides and combine like terms, and so get x to be 5. So there's your other solution. So my solutions are x equals 0, comma, x equal 5. And again, you can check. You don't have to, but let's check x equal 5. Let's see if that works. So if x equal 5, we go back to the original. So where we see an x, you plug in 5, so I get 5 squared minus 5 times 5, and I want to see if that's going to equal 0. Again, you don't have to check. Don't have to. 5 squared is 25. A negative 5 times 5 is a negative 25, and 25 minus 25 is equal to 0. Okay, that's a little question mark right here. And it is. Alright, now look at number 5. So what you should notice about number 5 is that it is not in standard form. See, there's a 3 on the right side. So you got to put it in standard form. Alright, so to put it in standard form, I'm going to have to rewrite this as 2x squared minus x. And then remember, you're going to subtract 3 from, or subtracting 3 from both sides. So 2x squared minus x minus 3 equal, and then 3 minus 3 is 0. Okay? So now it's in standard form. So this is in standard form. Once you put it in standard form, the next step is to factor. So the GCF on the left side is 1. So I'm going to go directly to the two binomials, and don't forget that is equal to 0. You got to say equals 0. 2x times x. Let's see, what's going to work will be 3 here, 1 here, and this would have to be negative, and this would have to be positive. And always check yourself. 2x times x is 2x squared. I'm checking using the FOIL method. FOIL. So first times first, 2x times x is x squared, 2x squared. For the L part, negative 3 times positive 1 is a negative 3, and let's check the outer and the inner. The outer is 2x, the inner is a negative 3x, a negative 3x, and a positive 2x is a negative 1x. That's what you wanted. So I factored it correctly. Now, remember the next step, I'm going to show you this, is the zero factor property. So we're going to solve this quadratic equation by setting both of those factors equal to 0. So both of these factors right here. So I get 2x minus 3 equals 0, or x plus 1 has to equal 0. So remember, if you have two or more factors who's brought to 0, then you definitely know one of them has to be a 0. So you set both of them equal to 0. So one of those has to be 0. Alright, and then you just solve this linear equation. So you're going to add 3 to both sides, combine like terms, 2x equals 3, and then to get x by itself, divide both sides by 2, and so you get x to be 3 halves. So there's one of your solutions. Over here, if you subtract 1 from both sides, combine like terms, positive 1 and negative 1 is 0, you get x to be negative 1. Alright, so your solutions are x equal 3 halves, comma, x equal negative 1. Alright, number 6, again, put in standard form. You got to make sure it's in standard form. This quadratic equation, if you want to solve this quadratic equation, it has to be in standard form. So you got to bring every term to one side, and you have to have 0 on the other. So basically what's happening, see what's going to happen is this. This is really what you have. So you're going to first of all subtract 5x on both sides, because remember you want to bring the 5x over. So basically subtracting 5x on both sides, then combine like terms, I'm going to get 3x squared minus 5x equal, this is 0, 2. And then just like a previous one, you're going to now subtract 2 from both sides. And then you're going to get 3x squared minus 5x minus 2 equal, don't forget the equal sign, and 2 minus 2 is 0. So now you put it in standard form. So this is standard form right here. Now we're going to factor. So the GCF on the left side is 1. So I'm going to go directly to two binomials. Alright, so this one's not that bad because the 3s prime. So we get 3x and x. And then for the 2, I'm going to put the 2 here and the 1 there, because I need a negative 5x. The last sign's negative, so both of these are different. So see this 3x times 2 is a 6x, and then 1 times x is x. So when I subtract them, 6x subtract 1x gives you the 5x, but you want a negative. In order for that to happen, this has to be x minus 2, and this has to be 3x plus 1. But again, before you go any further, always check your work. FOIL this thing out. 3x times x is 3x squared. A positive 1 times a negative 2 is a negative 2. The outer is a negative 6x. The inner is a positive 1x. A negative 6x and a positive 1x gives me a negative 5x. Alright, now, next, you're not done. Remember, you got to solve for x. You have to solve for x. So I'm going to set each of those equal to 0. I'm using the zero factor property. So I get 3x plus 1 equals 0, or x minus 2 has to equal 0. So one of those has to be 0. So subtract 1 from both sides, combine like terms, a positive 1 and negative 1 is 0. You get 3x equal negative 1, and then divide both sides by 3. I get x to be a negative 1/3. Over here, I get x to be 2. Those are your two solutions. So x equal negative 1/3, comma, x equal 2. Okay? All right, so that's the key to section 6.6, part A.